Before we get into HeartFlow and talk a little bit about your company's technology, I'd love to talk a little bit about how you guys got to where you are now. You both have had experience at sort of larger mid-tech firms. Can you just talk a little bit about how you got to HeartFlow and how that experience informs your current roles? Campbell, do you want to start maybe?
Yes. So my name is Campbell Rogers. I'm the Chief Medical Officer. Thank you. I'm Campbell Rogers. I'm the Chief Medical Officer. My background is in interventional cardiology, and I practiced for many years in that area. And in my mid-40s, took a turn and went into the medical device business, working for Johnson & Johnson for Cordis, overseeing research and development. And actually, apropos of that last discussion, HeartFlow, where I work now, came to Johnson & Johnson looking for investment about 10 years. And I got to know the technology and some of the people involved at the leadership level and the founders, and then made a transition and joined HeartFlow now 7.5 years ago. So that was my pathway.
That's great.
My name is Windi Hary. I'm the SVP of Clinical Quality and Regulatory at HeartFlow. And I started out at a little startup that was then acquired by a big fish. And through that, I ended up getting in touch with some colleagues that I worked at from that startup when they ended up at HeartFlow. And they said, hey, we've got this great opportunity. And I said, oh, that sounds really interesting. And I've been there 9 years now. You look surprised.
No, I forgot.
So let's talk about the technology itself then. Can you tell us a little bit about HeartFlow's tech, the process of, as a user, what it's like to walk through the technology?
Sure, let me start and then I'll turn it over to Windi. So the technology is intended to assist in the diagnosis of coronary disease in patients who are having symptoms that suggest they might have coronary disease. And there are different ways of doing that kind of diagnostic workup now, including stress tests and whatnot. And we actually sit at a place where we take images that are gathered at a hospital or at a physician's office from CT scans. The CT scans of the coronary arteries, taking pictures of arteries, come to us. We then apply a process to them, which Windi will describe, and send back information to the clinician, which says, here are where the blockages are in your patient's coronaries, and here's the impact those blockages have on flow. And the physician then incorporates that into his or her thinking about, do my patient's symptoms derive from this? How should I best treat these blockages and that kind of thing?
So when we get those coronary CT images, we actually extract the anatomic model. And part of that is done with automation and algorithms, and part of that is done with trained individuals who actually then take their eyeball to what the automation spits out, if you will, to make sure that we've got the most accurate anatomic model we can get. And then we apply computational fluid dynamics to solve for all the computations of blood flow. And we get this nice color map on the 3D model to indicate what those pressure ratios would be if you took the aortic pressure and the distal pressure to get what is equivalent to, but in our labeling it says exactly, compared to the invasive fractional flow reserve.
Very interesting. Thank you for the explanation. Talk a little bit about sort of the clinical need that drove the invention of this technology, and what kind of need is it filling in the marketplace?
Sure. So the pathway I described, which is the current standard, which involves stress testing most often, is well known in the cardiology world to have significant limitations in terms of accuracy. And the limitations are twofold. One is stress tests overdiagnose, and they can be falsely positive, falsely concerning, which then leads patients to have more tests, have invasive tests, only to find out, lo and behold, they don't really have coronary disease. The second way is they underdiagnose, and they can miss really important disease, especially if people have multiple arteries with blockages in them. It's not at all unusual that stress tests, which look for discrepancies from one part of the heart to another, if much of the heart is deprived of blood flow, there aren't discrepancies, so the stress test can be falsely negative. And therefore, somebody who might need really important, potentially life-saving treatment would not be sent down the path for such treatment. So that's the current limitation. The limitations are both clinical, as I described. They're also profoundly health economic in that the overdiagnosis leads to really not only invasive but expensive courses of diagnosis, only to arrive at a negative result. And we have now the clinical trials we've done and whatnot demonstrated that our technology allows a pathway which avoids many of those false positives while not causing more, in fact, causing fewer false negatives as well. So there's a pretty important clinical and also a health economic side to the pathway change.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you.
And I would just add, I think when the product was first conceived, what was the main focus of the clinical data was getting that validation data, comparing our product performance against the actual clinical comparator. And that was seen as like the ultimate in clinical data that we were going to achieve. And kind of what Campbell was speaking to with the health economics and this other data, we were so focused on getting that validation data that we didn't know that right behind that was going to be all this health economic data we were going to need.
Yeah, that's a great segue. Talk a little bit about that shift, because I think a lot of medtech companies, early on, they're like, we need to validate the technology with our clinical data, and maybe they miss some of the things that are on the periphery. So can you talk a little bit about how that data that you collected, the metrics you were aiming for, how that shifted post-validation of your technology?
Yeah, sure. Let me start, and then again, I think there's a kind of a business side to that, what's important for the business at different stages. There's also a regulatory side to that, which I want to make sure we come back and address, because that's been a pretty interesting and nuanced part of our journey. So on the clinical side, again, back to the prior discussion, when there was a lot of discussion around our companies being built for acquisition or for eventually independent, existences as public companies. That's the clinical data pathway needs to be tailored, informed by that discussion. So, as Windi said, we started off, so we have to get data that shows that our mathematics is correct. And the numbers that we spit out are the same as what actually is the gold standard. But once that's done, that is simply the price of admission to then say what happens to patients if you use this in their care, which of course then leads to commercialization discussions and where is it most optimally used, which patients benefit. So that's been the second part of the journey, is that whole phase of clinicals, which if the goal were simply prove that this is accurate, hand it to a few KOLs so that they can use it, then that first set would have been sufficient. But the second set for really broader commercialization is of course really essential. So I think from a regulatory standpoint, it would be interesting as well from the clinical data side.
Yeah, I think absolutely that first challenge of getting that validation data speaks to what you can put in your regulatory submissions for claims. So what you can put in your labeling, how you can talk about your product and to your customers. But even if you have a product and the performance in your labeling is great and you get that first regulatory thumbs up, then you're talking to physicians or whomever your customer is, and they're saying, well, what's going to happen to my patient? How much am I going to get paid for using your product? There are all these other questions kind of come in, and you have to think from a strategic perspective, how can we answer those, and how does that sort of dovetail in what else we might want to be able to say about our product? Because if you're going to put that effort and that expense forward to go down that longer pathway, you might as well get that benefit as well as being able to say additional things. So for instance, Campbell was saying that we went after we had our validation and performance data into sort of this outcomes data, and we now have significant clinical data to show that if our test says that you are negative, then they can defer you with very great outcomes for the patients. And we were able to add a summary of all that data now that we have it into our labeling and get that through FDA. So there's a strategy to it.
Yeah. Well, so I want to talk a little bit about that strategy and think a little bit more broadly about digital health and software, because of course this is an area that the FDA has evolved a bit on. So, I'd be interested to hear from you a little bit. How has your company strategy evolved as the FDA's own thinking on that matter has changed? Because it has changed pretty significantly.
Yes, it has. So when I started with HeartFlow in 2010, the executive team had already approached FDA, and FDA had very clearly said, there's nothing like your product. You're definitely a PMA product, right? And the way it works, for those of you that don't know, I'll summarize quickly. You're a 510K if you can find a predicate, something else on the market that is similar to what it is that you're bringing to market. It's kind of a known risk, safe and effective. If it's a high risk or unknown risk, it was automatically being classified as a class 3, and that would have been a PMA. And at the time, there was not a direct to de novo pathway when we started these conversations. So if we wanted to argue that we were not a class 3 product, we had to submit for a class 2 and be rejected, and then go back to a class 3. But all of that happened, those conversations happened over a period of 2-3 years, where then they ended up saying, you know what, it doesn't make sense, it's burdensome for companies to have to submit a 510K, wait for that rejection, so they created this direct to de novo meaning first of kind, and that they would assess based on the risk. And so we were able to successfully argue, we're not invasive, we never come into contact with the patient, we're not diagnosing, we're providing supplemental information, and able to talk them down to a 510K. That said, in the almost 7 years or so since we got that first 510K, FDA has always been just a little behind the ball from a technology perspective, because they can't write rules and regulations and guidance on what they don't know yet. And we're out here innovating, we're out here coming up with new products, new technologies, new ways to use that, and they're left going, oh, wait, this company's doing this, right? And they've really tried to kind of at least be running alongside that ball if they can't quite get out in front of it. And they've got all their new digital health programs, and they're really trying to clarify what is a medical device versus what isn't a medical device. They, like any organization, have limited resources, so they're looking to say, here's what we're actually going to regulate versus these other items that we think are of low enough risk that they don't warrant our attention right now. And then we had the 21st Century Cures Act, where they just said all these things are so low risk, they're sure they're a medical device, we're not going to be looking at them, right? But they've really tried to get in front of it, and in fact, almost a year ago now, they had, for the very first time that I remember, published a thought paper, shall we say, that kind of was like FDA saying, here are our thoughts on what we're thinking. No promises, no guarantee, like it was all about what if we were to put AI instead of in the design process, but actually in production use. So what if you were to have some type of software product that you put into production that then could learn and improve or modify itself while it's being used? And this was, I mean, from my perspective, because I've been in regulatory now for however many years, this was groundbreaking. Like FDA was like peeking, pulling the curtain back and letting us peek back there, and this is what they're thinking, and it was great, because now we're able to sort of, now that we know what they're thinking, we're going to be able to leverage some of that in how we approach them and the arguments that we make in our submissions. But anyway.
Yeah, well, you know what? Digital health is such an interesting area, particularly when it comes to regulation, because I know there are a number of companies that are sort of saying to themselves, all right, we really want to be on the front lines with this and help FDA and work together as partners. And then, there are other companies that are saying, I'd rather not be the first. I'm going to kind of let people go through these unproven pathways, and then I'll jump in and do it myself. How has you guys have kind of been on the forefront of all of this with FDA as they've evolved over the years. How has that impacted how you've moved forward strategically from a regulatory perspective?
Good question. I think I would start by saying that the engagement that we had with FDA, because we were sort of the first down this, de novo pathway, or at least first for us, that there was a lot of engagement, and it created, there was a lot of back and forth, and it created a lot of trust between ourselves and the individuals in the organization that we had to interact with. And I think that has really helped just as a culture for our strategy, because in some larger companies and in years past that wasn't how you approached the regulators. You kept your cards close to your chest. You only showed them what you wanted them to see. And we've been really open, and they've been really responsive to that. And I think it allowed them to maybe share with us that they were open to these new ways of thinking, so that over the years we've been able to have, just a phone call and, well, what do you think about this? And almost a slightly more informal sort of discussions with FDA that really help to lubricate things once we get further along in the process.
Sure, yeah, that's interesting. So thinking a little bit about the technology itself, I'm wondering, you guys have been with HeartFlow for a while, so I'm wondering if you could share a bit about how the technology has evolved as you've moved through the commercialization process. One of the things we hear often about medical device companies when they're bringing a product to the market is that you have to remain flexible and listen to the customers, listen to the end users, that sort of thing, and be able to kind of react accordingly. So I'm wondering if you could share some of your own experience in watching the technology grow.
Sure. Yeah, I'll start. I think there are a couple of axes along which we've put the most focus in terms of advancing our first product. One of them is the speed with which the information gets back to clinicians. And that from the very beginning was a critical kind of key performance indicator for both how much this technology would or wouldn't help patients, but also how much physicians would actually use it. So when we started with, when we first had approval and were early commercializing, it was in the neighborhood of a couple of days. Somebody would send us a CT scan, a couple of days later they'd get back an answer. And then through a variety of both process changes and also internal, or in the product itself, that now has come down to, it's about 2 hours if somebody really wants it fast and they flag it, and it's about 4 or 5 hours sort of on average. So that was the most important. That didn't change anything about the information itself, the accuracy or how it was presented, but it changed how usable it was. So that was a huge focus of many people for a long time, and it continues to this day. The second is how the information is presented back, because again, it's as Windi has said, and as you said, Sarah, it's a very different type of product. It's not a thing, right? It's not a med tech thing. So how it comes back to physicians, how they access it. Can they access it on their phone? Can they access it when they need it in the cath lab? How easy is it to get? Can they send the results to other members of the care team and say, well, this is my patient, but now I want him to have a bypass operation. I need to share this with the cardiac surgeon. That ability to sort of take the digital data and share it, obviously there are huge overlays of security and privacy that are germane to that second discussion. So I'd say those are the two axes along which we've made the most focus with our core product, and then there are some additional products which have been developed, which are coming on the heels. I don't know if that's kind of what you're getting at, but that from a clinical perspective, those were the key deliverables.
Yeah, I think maybe what we neglected to mention in the beginning is that when you get the physician gets the information back, they're logging into their browser and they're seeing a 3D model that they can twist and rotate and zoom in and zoom out and sort of interrogate the information. And so it was a big step to move that to your iPhone or your tablet, and sort of meant for that viewing platform. And I think a few people in the room here from HeartFlow deserve a nod for all that hard work that they did. Then you optionally have the ability to download a 2D record, a PDF, that has some critical images that you can store. And so prior to being able to, these features that Campbell was talking about, share this information, physicians were actually having to download this 2D image, these 2D images, and email them along. And so there has been a significant effort to improve the usability of the product for our customers. And then of course move into devices and easy accessibility for our customers.
Yeah. Accessibility and usability, both really crucial points, right, for device development, any product development effort. Campbell, I'd love for you to talk just a little bit about, your end user is a doctor, it's a clinician. So I'd love for you to talk a little bit. We've talked a lot today about winning over the hearts and minds and trust of patients. I'd love for you to share a little bit about how you guys have thought about going about winning over the hearts and minds of doctors, right? A totally different population of people in most cases. So talk a bit about how your company has looked at that effort.
Sure. Yeah, it's really complicated. It's the hearts, it's the minds, and it's also the wallets. Those to be perfectly frank, especially in cardiology where it's so incredibly prevalent, and this pathway of stress testing I described is incredibly ingrained. It's very well compensated, and a lot of it's habit. I mean, physicians are just creatures of habit. And so the key levers that we have and have used are, one, clinical data, because that is, in the end of the day, the sort of most valuable currency to say we're actually not just trying to get you to believe something we're saying. We actually have the proof. We're asserting things. We have proof that what we're asserting is true. So that's the first. And then the second is working within the changing U.S., especially in the U.S. ecosystem of increasing value, focus on value-based care, and saying, okay, that's a spot where everyone ends up winning with this technology. And probably the place that is the most visible is in the UK, where in the UK it's an incredibly it is a value-based system, the National Health Service, and this new pathway that instead of stress testing has become the standard pathway. In the guidelines, physicians and hospitals are paid to incentivize them to put patients into this pathway. So that we look at that as sort of the initial, the proof is in the pudding. It really does seem to be working there. And once those different levers are lined up, physicians will do the right thing for their patients, but they're not going to do it if they're going to lose their shirt financially, or if it takes them, it's very inconvenient for the patient because it takes a week to get the data back instead of, a couple of hours. So each of those things is important in answering that, sort of unlocking that knot.
As much as you are able to, can you guys share a little bit about what you're excited for in the next year or so for HeartFlow, like what's ahead?
Yeah, so we recently got regulatory clearance for our newest product, which is an add-on of sorts to our current product. And we'll be launching it sometime next year, where once you have the 3D model, you could select a lesion that you can see anatomically by the narrowing and maybe even by the color drop in the overlay, and ask the model to remodel itself for a certain area over the course of that lesion or lesions, and see how we would model that new anatomy. See how I'm very carefully not using some words. It's regulatory. But essentially helping physicians to simulate different treatment scenarios once they're actually in the cath lab, and to determine if treating certain lesions would be effective at changing the blood flow for the patient.
Yeah, that's super interesting stuff. We'll definitely be keeping our eyes open for that from you guys. I've got a couple more questions, but I thought I would throw it open to the audience. Any questions for our panelists? Just feel free to raise your hand. Chris.
I'd be interested, like your technology, do you see any potential with it with diagnosing aneurysms? Because it just sounds like there could be something there.
Yeah, I think in the general sort of focus of the form-function relationships of blood vessels and the flow within them, absolutely. And there are other, peripheral vascular disease and intracranial disease. The focus has been 100% on the heart because A, it's the biggest market, and B, it's the circulation in which there are the most clear reference points for us to say, this notion of fractional flow reserve, which is what we model, that exists in the heart and it's recognized. It's in the guidelines, and we're able to say, yes, look at that. We provide the same thing non-invasively. That same sort of stalking horse doesn't really exist in some of those other areas. So the principles should apply, but the work required to develop those markets and products for them and validate them is much, much more. So we haven't really gone down that path yet, aside from, again, hearkening back to the earlier discussion and the intellectual property side.
Right.
As you prove your value of the technology so well, are you seeing any payers asking you to be the second opinion on a close call by a physician? Is that one for you?
So not really. It's interesting. We interact a huge amount with the payers, as you're getting at. In the world of coronary disease, they're relatively reticent to be really directive. It's not like joint replacements where they're more than happy to say, go to these hospitals and have this joint replacement. Coronary disease a little bit less, so it's kind of like oncology. It has the same kind of ethos to it. But they are willing to be somewhat directive. So for example, the real tool that payers have to govern use is pre-authorization, whether it be for drugs or for procedures or for tests. So we are seeing them turn those levers and say, I'm going to make it a little bit harder to get a stress test or a cath, and I'm going to make it easier to get a CT scan. So that's most sort of at the ground level, we do see those changes, yes.
I don't know if your model is probabilistic or deterministic, but how do you account for personalization of the model?
Sure. Yeah, no, it's a really good question. as I mentioned to the earlier question, the coronary circulation is relatively rich in really well-described form-function relationships. And so it's very personalized. We get the coronary CT data, which brings with it enough information about how much flow is going to the heart as a whole and what the shape of the arteries are. Because with current coronary CT angiography, when it's well done, it's incredibly high fidelity anatomic images. So that's the information we need. And then the relationships of form and function are so precise and so kind of homogeneous patient to patient to patient, we're able to deduce information about pressure and flow based on the patient-specific model that we generate.
Yes.
So thank you for that very insightful talk. Out of curiosity, you talked about very many different points that have made you be fast in class in what you're doing. And you mentioned how you were fast in class in the FDA, and you mentioned the UK, how you were fast in class in getting into the NHS. And congratulations for being picked up that quickly. If you, in your own opinion, if you had to look at your company, what 3 factors would you say make you stand apart from competition? You did mention very many things, but I'm just curious from your point of view, what do you think makes you be that fast in terms of innovation?
Oh, that's a really interesting
Can
question.
I start with
Please.
one?
Yes,
You can
please.
take number 2.
You can have all 3.
So I think, one of the things that we are really proud of is the fact that we, as a culture, really believe in quality. And, we hear a lot from customers. We want something that we can put on our workstation, press a button, and get the same results. And there have been studies done by other organizations when it comes to segmentation and these types of tools that everybody can access and use on their own, is that your output quality is only as good as your input quality. And if the 3 of us were all to push that button, we could get 3 different answers based on whatever we've defined as those inputs. And so what we have and what is also regulated, our product isn't, for the FDA, isn't just the software, it's the process by which we use it. And so it's those outputs that FDA sort of regulates. We have requirements for reproducibility, and we monitor for our reproducibility. So there's just a level of quality that we can ensure with our product that you're not going to get at a hospital. And honestly, at a hospital, they're going to have a fellow or somebody on staff who doesn't want to spend an hour segmenting, to push that button, and we can do it. And I don't want to speak for you, but so I think just that high level of quality and the monitoring that we put into that to create that reproducibility.
Yeah, and I would just come back to the clinical data. I think the second piece would be having that overcomes a whole host of objections.
Yeah, I would, just a side note, I've been at several conferences where competitive technology, get up on the podium and they talk about how this, they use very fancy words to essentially say this technology is completely validated, and they show a whole list of studies that were all conducted by HeartFlow. So compared to our competitive technology, the data is actually ours.
Other questions for our panelists? Interesting that both of you have experience in sort of larger ponds of the medical device industry. I'd love for you guys to talk just from your own experiences operationally, what it was like to go from much larger firms to leading things at HeartFlow.
I mean, it's night and day. Because I started in a smaller company and then, went through an acquisition and experienced that larger company life, it went from being sort of this flexible, agile, responsive environment to incredibly bureaucratic, red tape. Everybody's siloed. And it's just big companies, right? And I think that when I came back to the small company environment, it was great to be back in that agile environment. And I think we're trying to maintain that as much as possible as we grow. Some areas more successfully than others, but I think that's probably the biggest difference, is that there's everybody in a large company seems to have a very specific role to play versus in a smaller company where you have the ability influence things and be participating in more areas.
What was your experience like?
Yeah, I would certainly agree with what Windi said. I think it probably depends a lot on the leadership of the company, and we're fortunate to have leadership which is very open to having people in a small, agile environment try different things. And people who want to grow in a certain area, they're given the opportunity to do that, which may be harder in bigger companies. Again, it's not a bash on big medtech companies, are incredibly efficient organizations. And in my time at Johnson & Johnson, I learned a huge amount that would not have been learned in a small company. So it's not there's no value judgment, but profoundly different.
Yeah. So for our younger startups that are maybe just kind of entering the space, do you guys have any advice that you would give them, reflecting back on what you have learned? Putting you on the spot there.
I think sort of to carry over from the session prior into this one, when you first have that great idea, look as far out as you can in your vision. Where do you see that product? How do you see it being used? Have you sold your company? And then walk backwards to the type of data that you're going to need to collect to sort of come up with that strategic plan. Too many small companies look right in front of them, and then they get to that spot, and then they go, oh, what's next? So as far out as you can, claims data, that's great, right? What are you going to want your customers to say and your sales force to say about your product? And then walk backwards.
Yeah, sure. And from a regulatory perspective, that's extremely important, right? You've got to be able to set the appropriate metrics and ensure that you're...
Even from a patent perspective.
Right.
As we were earlier talking.
Right, sure. Campbell, what about you? Advice for your younger startups?
Yeah, no, I think Windi hit on it. I think looking out, trying to predict, at least in some general sense, who are going to be the key stakeholders that are going to be influencing your success. And it's not just going to be the physicians, it's also going to be the people who pay for healthcare. And thinking about that world, at least at a very high level, as you are even just at the initial genesis of an idea. Not that you're going to get locked into anything, but so that you at least are cognizant of and thinking about it as you're getting clinical data, as you're designing the product. Because the make or break will be those stakeholders just as much as it is the physicians.
That's great. Any other questions? No? All right. Well, please join me in a round of applause for our lovely speaker.